This 16th century map shows the classical Western view of the globe, filled with neat lines and vast, empty spaces waiting for European explorers to arrive. For hundreds of years, the history of exploration has centered on a single storyline: brave captains sailing into the unknown and charting the world for the first time. But while Portuguese and Spanish ships were testing the Atlantic, Arab and Asian seafarers were already routinely crossing the Indian and Pacific Oceans. These navigators built completely distinct cartographic traditions. Instead of mapping coastlines onto the rigid, grid-based latitude and longitude system used in Europe, many early Asian maps arranged geography around circular, religiously influenced concepts of landmasses. Because these two mapping cultures evolved in total isolation from one another, Western records have consistently overlooked the massive geographical database built by non-Western explorers. In December 1511, the Portuguese galleon Flor de Lamar was caught in a brutal storm in the Strait of Malacca and tore apart. The ship carried a massive, intricately detailed world map created by a Javanese pilot, a masterwork of geography that sank to the ocean floor alongside the cargo of looted treasure. The map itself was destroyed by the sea. Our only evidence that it ever existed comes from a letter, written 4 months later by Portuguese Admiral Afonso de Albuquerque, addressed to King Manuel of Portugal. The specific details recorded in Albuquerque's letter contradict the standard timeline of global discovery. Treating this 1512 letter as forensic evidence, Albuquerque inventories the lost Javanese map. It contained the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal's coast, the Red Sea, the Spice Islands, and remarkably, Brazil. The chart also documented internal Chinese navigation routes moving deep inland. This single chart encompassed the Atlantic coast of South America, the southern tip of Africa, and the far edges of the Pacific. Naturally, modern historians like Armando Cortázar look at that vast geographical spread and push back on the document's implications. Their skepticism centers on a practical geography problem. To chart Brazil independently, a 15th century Javanese navigator would have had to cross the entire expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a drastically longer and more dangerous route than the shorter Atlantic crossing used by the Portuguese. Because of this immense distance, scholars suggest the Javanese cartographer didn't map the entire world. Instead, they likely acquired an existing Portuguese sea chart, copied the Western Atlantic details, and then tacked on their local Asian knowledge. If that theory holds true, the Javanese map was just a clever imitation, rather than proof of an independent, highly advanced Asian cartographic network. But a closer read of Albuquerque's own words pokes holes in the copycat theory. Looking at the original Portuguese text, the admiral tells the king, "It seems to me, sire, that this was the best thing I have ever seen." Albuquerque was a highly experienced naval commander. If he were looking at a crude, stitched-together copy of a Portuguese chart that he was already entirely familiar with, he wouldn't write to his sovereign in a tone of absolute astonishment. The letter also mentions a glaring geographical gap. The Javanese chart completely left out the Salate Islands, an archipelago located between Java and Malacca. The Portuguese had thoroughly mapped the Salates. If the Javanese pilot had simply traced a captured Portuguese map, those islands would almost certainly be drawn right there in the middle. Their absence heavily implies an independent source. Beyond that, merging a European map with an Asian one in the early 1500s was a technical nightmare. A cartographer would have to perfectly integrate two completely different coordinate systems, scales, and coastal drawing methods into a seamless global projection. The evidence suggests Albuquerque was looking at an original, highly advanced feat of navigation built from the ground up by Asian pilots. The Javanese map is gone, but we do have concrete proof that Portuguese explorers regularly relied on indigenous cartography to navigate the East. A young Portuguese pilot named Francisco Rodrigues traveled through the Orient in the early 1500s, precisely around the time Albuquerque wrote his lyre. These two hand-drawn charts show the Malay Peninsula and the northern part of Sumatra, recorded by Rodrigues. When we cut to his subsequent charts covering the vast East Indies and the Moluccas, we are looking at direct adaptations. Rodrigues interviewed native pilots, studied their indigenous sea charts, and explicitly converted their local knowledge to fit European navigational norms. These surviving documents provide physical proof that the European charting of the Far East was built by tracing directly over pre-existing Asian navigation networks. When Portuguese and Spanish ships finally rounded the tip of Africa and entered the Indian Ocean, they were not sailing into a blank, uncharted void. They were arriving at the edges of a highly networked, heavily trafficked maritime superhighway that had already been extensively mapped by the people who lived there. The problem is that maps are working documents used on wet, wooden ships. They rot, they tear, and they sink in storms. The survival rate for any working sea chart is near zero. Because the Great Javanese map went to the bottom of the ocean, and European texts like Albuquerque's letter were safely archived in royal libraries, the story of global exploration was written entirely from the perspective of the West. But the fragments left behind prove that the drive to measure and map the world was a shared global endeavor, thriving long before European empires claimed the final draft.